Recently, my younger brother asked why there were colors on the pride flag outside of the typical 6 that comprise the rainbow. I went over the meaning of various colors, which he understood. Then I got to black and explained that it represents the thousands of queer people lost to AIDS. What does AIDS have to do with queer people, he asked. To his young mind in 2024, AIDS is just another disease. But going back 20, 30, 40 years ago, that couldn't be further from the truth. AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, was previously called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, and before that, it was merely gay cancer. The United States government remains silent and therefore complicit in the deaths of not just queer individuals, but homeless individuals, drug users, and other minoritized demographics. Ever since the emergence of AIDS in queer circles in the late 1970s and early 1980s, queer art has been made about it. Sometimes, these artists had mainstream success, such as Keith Haring's illustrations and Freddie Mercury's music. But a medium of AIDS-era art that never broke into cis-heteronormative circles is new queer cinema of the late 1980s through late 1990s. Why? Probably because of its thesis, which permeates through every visual, auditory, and written detail. And what's that thesis? The AIDS epidemic was an insidious genocide against queer and underprivileged communities. Or, as eloquently stated in Greg Araki's film, Totally Fucked Up,
government-sponsored genocide. Biological warfare. I mean, think about it. A deadly virus that spread only through premarital sex and needle drugs? It's like a born-again Nazi Republican wet dream come true.
The aim of new queer cinema wasn't to coerce the cis-heteronormative public into feeling sympathy for queer folks affected by AIDS. Instead, it was intended to be as alienating as possible to cisgender heterosexuals and serve as a form of agonized self-expression on behalf of oppressed, dying people. Even though it doesn't have the unparalleled cool of Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho, or the relentless realism of Wong Kar-wai's Happy Together, perhaps one of the most exemplary pieces of new queer cinema thematically is Todd Haynes' Poison. The film is an anthology comprising of 3 metaphor-filled stories: Hero, Horror, and Homo. Hero is a mockumentary about a young boy named Richie who murders his father and literally flies out the window. Horror details the ambitious Dr. Graves who drinks a pure libido serum, which then wreaks havoc on his suburban community. And Homo chronicles 2 prisoners who wind up falling in love. Poison is one of those films where it's truly up to the individual to interpret what they see, but my opinion as a gay transgender man in film studies goes as follows. Hero sums up public attitudes towards the LGBTQ+ community. Just as the colorful cast of characters have conflicting information on whether Richie was a puny nothing or a worrisome threat, public spaces carry that same attitude towards queer people. In fact, the idea that the enemy is quote-unquote at the same time too strong and too weak has been proposed by cultural theorist Umberto Eco as one of 14 hallmarks of fascism. When Richie murders his abusive father and takes flight from the window, it represents how the queer community needs to leave behind normative notions to organize and thrive. Horror is the most on-the-nose of the stories in the anthology. It basically encompasses the discrimination and paranoia that came with the emergence of AIDS and how people reacted by othering those affected, whether it be direct victims of the disease or people from relevant communities.
Every one of you down there is exactly the same. Only you'll never know it. You'll never know it.
Even though the movie doesn't have conventional characters that the audience can latch onto, Dr. Graves is made sympathetic by his circumstances. Also, it's tragically ironic that Haynes decided to name this afflicted character Dr. Graves. Homo is perhaps the most abstract out of all of these anthology stories, and my personal interpretation is that it's what happens when queer folks take the words and oppression of cis-heteronormative institutions close to heart. The prison depicted is made insufferable not by the official rules or the warden, but by gay prisoners targeting and excluding one another. The deeply disturbing rape scene that occurs in this section is metaphorical in my opinion. It's a surreal depiction of betrayal and denial of queer livelihood. In short, Homo represents internalized homophobia to the max. It's incorrect to say that mainstream Hollywood refused to constructively talk about AIDS because they decided to with Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, which was 13 years since AIDS began to wreak havoc on underprivileged communities. Sure, it's directed by Jonathan Demme. Sure, it's well directed. Sure, it's all from a place of sincerity. But it's presented in such a cishet lens. I can appreciate how it brought mainstream awareness to queer issues and depicts queer people as more than fodder for gags, but for it to be considered the end-all be-all in AIDS-era cinematic activism? No. No. We barely get any insight into gay protagonist Andrew Beckett's queerness beyond the occasional kiss with his lover and his stereotypical appreciation for opera and cabaret. When talking about queer issues, queer voices need to be prioritized. This is why I'm so grateful that 1990s new queer cinema as an artistic movement is being reevaluated by my generation. The stories and struggles depicted on screen resonate more than ever as queer folks and other intersecting demographics face unprecedented pushback against their livelihoods. People taking action by going lights, camera action is something that needs to be utilized more in the modern fight for queer rights. I went this whole video without bringing up Midnight Cowboy.